Gen Z-led protests across Sub-Saharan Africa are reshaping the region's political landscape, driven by frustration, coordinated online, and evolving in form and intensity. These movements have surged over the past 2 years, with young people mobilizing against long-standing grievances, including economic instability, corruption, and political exclusion. Unlike previous generations, they're leveraging social media, decentralized organization, and rapid mobilization, often catching governments off guard. The analysis is part of our latest intelligence report, The Rise of Youth Protests Across Sub-Saharan Africa. To unpack the key findings and what they mean for regional stability, here's our in-house intelligence analyst, Joshua George.
Youth protests in Africa aren't a new phenomenon. There has been a significant wave across 2024 and 2025. In 2024, we notably had protests across Kenya, Nigeria, and Mozambique. And in 2025, so far, we have had protests in Togo, Kenya, and Angola. A large reason for this wave of Gen Z demonstrations is the rapidly growing youth demographic across Africa. It is the fastest growing age demographic. And there is a series of frustrations among Africa's youth. These include a series of economic shocks from COVID and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the rising cost of living, inflation, widespread youth unemployment, widespread corruption, disenfranchisement, and finally authoritarianism from many of the political regimes. These protests have tended to differ from previous generations' protests. While Gen X relied on top-down opposition-led protests, which were slow to develop but became quite sustained and were easily decapitated by arresting the leadership, Gen Z protests, on the other hand, have generally been bottom-up and decentralized. Rather than political opposition figures, they've largely relied on influencers. These waves have spread through social media and have gained traction very quickly. However, they have struggled to become sustained. And because of the bottom-up nature of them, they often struggle to articulate their demands. Government reactions to these protests tend to rely heavily on security crackdowns, including live ammunition, crowd dispersal measures such as tear gas, as well as mass arrests, disinformation campaigns to counter the narratives presented by Africa's youth, as well as internet shutdowns to cut the support for the protests off from the source and prevent them becoming sustained. We assess that several countries are at risk of experiencing widespread youth protests in the upcoming months. There are 3 elections in October in Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tanzania, where there is widespread youth disenfranchisement, corruption, unemployment, and a rising cost of living, as well as increasingly authoritarian governments who may be perceived as rigging the elections. In December, there are elections in Guinea, and in January in Uganda. In addition, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has already seen protests in 2024 related to the M23 insurgency. There is an upcoming potential peace deal between the government and M23. If this falls apart, something we assess as likely, then widespread youth protests in Kinshasa are highly likely. Risk mitigation measures include conducting a pre-travel risk assessment, intelligence monitoring, and journey management planning before you travel. If in country and protests begin to escalate, you should monitor the situation, avoid protest locations, and remain in contact with emergency contacts. And finally, after the protests have subsided, you should conduct check-ins, situation assessments, and continued vigilance, as many protests can come in waves. Things to look out for before you travel are upcoming election dates, a previous precedence of protests, as well as national holidays. Given the prevalence of economic issues and authoritarianism across sub-Saharan Africa, youth protests are unlikely to subside in the coming months or years. In fact, they're likely to gain traction. Kenya marked a watershed moment in 2024, which inspired numerous other protests. Given the close proximity of multiple elections towards the end of 2025, there is a realistic possibility that this could have a snowball effect, whereby protests begin in one and numerous other protests are inspired by these, even in countries which have not yet seen sustained protest movements.
That concludes this episode of the Global Risk Podcast. For further insight, including country-level analysis, protest timelines, and risk mitigation advice, you can read the full report on our website at solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.